Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a frontline update for the Ukraine war for the 14th of April 2025. This is the longest I've ever done a stretch without doing a mapping update, 11 days. So this is an 11-day mapping update. Expect some huge changes to the front line. Sorry, I was away for a week and that's what precipitated this, but we have a lot of pink and purple, puce, cherry red, whatever you want to call it, Russian pins in the map to denote changes in favour of the Russians, and not so many blue ones, but there are some blue ones, mainly for Syriac maps, interestingly, not so much for Andrew Perpetua. We go to the Kursk region, we can see that the two areas that were left for the Ukrainians to control, there has been a closing down of the southernmost one. It is a problem. The Ukrainians are pretty much pushed out of Kursk, as according to Syriac maps, and the Russians are pushing further to the south inside the Sumy region, really, causing some issues for the Ukrainians if this is to be believed. We have Lochnia, a village quite far into Ukraine. If you think that initially they got in through Novenka area, this is the border there. They've got well past there and they're advancing. It seems not crazily quickly, but they are taking land again, though only according to Syriac maps. No change for Andrew Perpetua there. And likewise in the area that the Ukrainians still control inside Kursk, Syriac maps has the Russians making some gains there. Not quite sure what's going on in this area of Demidovka and inside Belgorod. There are lots of different polygons for Syriac maps around here. You can see there are different colors. Just he's randomly, or they randomly chosen to have these overlays that essentially are no different. Like all these three colors signify Russian land inside Russia. So you really shouldn't have these different colors, but then he's denoting that this is the region that, the Kursk region that was seeing so much activity. And I don't really understand what's going on here. There seems to be a bizarre situation with polygons and pins denoting changes there, but not really sure what's happening. This is one area I really don't know much about. Belgorod has been off the news for some time. So if we go back, considering I've done this for 11 days, actually, 8 days ago, we had this morning. Ukrainian forces advanced up to 600 meters into Russian positions. I actually reported this near Pokrovsk, Belgorod region. Russia's 34th Brigade retreated, losing ground. Now the 155th Marine Brigade is reportedly counterattacking to reclaim lost positions, and that's according to the Russian mill blogger Romanov. That was 8 days ago, and I've not heard anything about Belgorod since then. So I don't know what's going on there. Don't pay any attention to those polygons and pins because I think it's all a bit weird. Then we go to Volchansk. I've seen some video footage out of Volchansk to show that it's just completely flattened and destroyed. It appears that the Russians might have some control of a couple of buildings south of where they were, according to Syriac maps, but not according to Andrew Perpetua. There's been no real change here for some time. We hear of Ukrainians putting pressure on the Russians there, but I've not seen any territorial exchanges particularly for some time. And then look at how many pins there are along this northeastern axis here, with a lot of movement further to the north, nearer the border over the Oskil River. And this is definitely a worry for the Ukrainians. This is Andrew Perpetua's light pink pins suggesting that's where the Russian line was. And now his blue line comes not as far as Syriac maps, comes across here and across the river. So this is that's along the river, but then up here it's across the river. And then over to this area, we have control of land across the river up here towards Kamyanka, a place that we've not talked about before. It's a fairly large, it's a large enough settlement there. Small, bigger than a lot of these tiny villages peppering this predominantly agricultural area. The whole of Luhansk, really. But this is a real challenge. Syriac maps has the Russians advancing even further, and definitely not good news that they are right across the Oskil River, all the way along this whole sector now. No change, interestingly, to here. So 11 days around Zaporizhzhia, no change signified there. Some tiny changes elsewhere along the front, not really worth discussing too much. I think that might be some glitches there. And then a bit of activity around Pishchane. So I've often called this the Pishchane sector, where the Russians have got to the Oskil River much further to the south. Here we have an indication that the Russians have made some gains around there, around this place, Kolesnikivka, which is nearer the Oskil River. And then further inland, you can see some small changes there. That looks a bit glitchy. There's some funky stuff going on around here. So sorry, the mapping next update should, these will be ironed out, and some small changes in favor of the Russians around here. But this is where there have been some claims that the Ukrainians, although this is now going back to the 5th of April. So the problem being that this is quite a long time ago. Goodness me, 9 days ago, the Ukrainians were pushing back north of Pishchane here. If we see, that's Pishchane. Is that Tabaivka? Pishchane, yeah, Tabaivka. So around here, the Ukrainians have actually pushed back, but that was 9 days ago. So who knows whether that has changed since. But you can see there's a very different interpretation of the Russian defensive lines around here. If we go back to Pishchane and Tabaivka, that's to say, I think, it's going to look very different to what that looks like. But of course, there's been some time elapsed in between then. But this is just going to be a quick synopsis, and we'll hopefully, when it gets more regular again, we'll have a much more accurate appraisal of what's going on a more frequent timeline. This is actually where I was talking about this morning. Reporting from Ukraine had a video concerning a Russian attack through here, Ryarodka, Novohayarivka area. Quite swampy around here. You can see that there's a river around here. This is the Zherebets River, and the Russians have put pontoon bridges across there and have been trying to advance. The Ukrainians retook Nadia some time back, and I think the 3rd Assault Brigade around here has been hammering the Russians that they've been trying to advance predominantly on foot with literally hundreds of small drones, sometimes 5 to 7 inch drones, taking out individual soldiers one at a time with these drones. And the claim from reporting from Ukraine is that over a sort of week period, the Russians have lost 450 soldiers pretty much in this attack, predominantly on foot. But it does show, or Surat map shows, that they've gained some land. That's going to be coming from the Russian MOD. Whether that's actually happened, they've certainly been attacking there. And then when we come further to the south, around what was the Terny, Torska, Yampolivka area, now, I mean, the Russians have really expanded their control all around here. That is definitely worrying, obviously, for the Ukrainians. Coming further to the south along these water features, these reservoirs, the Russians moving to the south there towards Zaporizhzhia and Torska. And then further to the north of Terny, they've really crossed, again, the Zherebets River here, on the way towards the Oskil, which is much further away down here than it is up there. As the Oskil sort of closes in, the Zherebets closes in, they get a little bit closer up there. But the Russians really making a good go of it around here, taking quite a bit of land and subsuming a few small settlements as well. Then we come down to Belgorod area. Surat maps again showing some gains here where Andrew Perpetua doesn't, and this is one of these areas that I think there's a significant difference of opinion. Andrew Perpetua has the Russians a little bit pushed further back. It could be a rejig there up in the forest area. We've got a difficult terrain for the Russians to take. We've got mountains here, and we've got forest there, thick forest with rivers, and the river banks in this area are really, really steep, so it's very difficult to get across the Siversk Donetsk River with mechanized equipment. And yet we have the Russians advancing way further, according to Surat maps, than Andrew Perpetua. There's a really significant difference of opinion between the two mappers here, right the way down this whole Siversk front line. So that difference seems to be continuing and being exacerbated. But I don't know what the actual reality is there. I mean, it's probably the case that this will be all kind of fairly much a grey zone. Large areas that would be just open fields, and control of those is difficult to ascertain. It's not like you have, as I keep saying, one person standing every 5 meters with their hands up saying, "Yeah, we control this land." You'll have people in a tree line here, people in a tree line there, dynamic attacks going on, and knowing actually who controls what field is not an easy job. Right, some regains around Sakyovansety and Vadyakivka here, which is north of Bakhmut, north of Solidar there, or northwest of Solidar. Some gains for the Ukrainians, as according to Suryat Maps. It could be a mapping rejig, not sure. I've not kept an eye on frontline activities as much as I should, so sorry about that. Then some gains around Chasiv Yar, just filling in a few gaps here. The Russians taking back some land that they had previously lost in this northern area. It's been a bit to and fro, but then filling it in the middle to a degree, according to particularly Suryat Maps there. But then the Ukrainians gaining further to the south on the way towards Stupochki, north of this T0504 highway that goes to Konstantinivka down here. Bit of push and shove, but not good news really that Chasiv Yar is, the Russians are having some success there. This is the area that we were just talking about. Pro-Ukrainian channel reports the Ukrainians advanced south of Chasiv Yar. But yeah, trouble up there in the midst of Chasiv Yar. But 11 days worth of fighting, I guess, that's to be expected. They still haven't taken Chasiv Yar, of course. And then further to the south, some gains, according to Suryat Maps, around the canal area north of Druzhba, south of Ozeryanivka. So you've got the canal that comes down here that broadly separates the two forces, and the Ukrainians taking back some land where the Russians had got across the canal further to the south. And then it's mainly regains for the Russians around Toretsk, as according to predominantly Suryat Maps, but also in the centre here, according to Andrew Perpetua as well. So this is an area where the Ukrainians have really been pushing the Russians back, and now it looks like the Russians have some momentum behind their movements. A bit of rejigging in certain places, but I think the Russians are gearing up now to push again, and indeed 11 days is a long time in the mapping world, because we can see a whole load of advances where we hadn't really seen much advance previously. So if you remember, you got the T0504 highway that comes through Konstantinivka, from Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, all the way down here to the Pokrovsk area. There's Pokrovsk. We've got this junction that has previously been taken by the Russians and taken back by the Ukrainians, now pretty much in the grey zone. But the road it is interdicted as far as, like, you're not going to be driving down here. This is under fire control. But the Russians do not have control of it at the moment. But further to the east, they seem to have made some fairly significant gains where they haven't been advancing really at all previously. And actually, both mappers agree with that around the Alexandropil area here, Pantelemonivka, but then also here Kalinove. This is a kind of a new area for Russian advance, and it's like a whack-a-mole, but at the moment the Russian moles are coming up again with quite a lot of frequency and in an awful lot of places. So even in the Pokrovsk area, where the Ukrainians were having their success around Kotlina, around Solone, it looks like the Russians have pushed back. Shevchenko, we have here some earlier reports in, so this is going back to the 5th, and this one on the 7th, a bit later, but on the 5th, so that's 9 days ago, pro-Ukrainian channel report the Ukrainians advancing in Veselivka, and this is pretty much the last time we've seen claims of Ukrainian advances. So it's a week ago, Ukrainians advancing there. Now we have the Russians advancing there, as according to Suryat Maps. And now on the 7th, so just a couple of days later from that, south of Pokrovsk, Russians were geolocated in the northeastern part of Shevchenko, reversing gains by the Ukrainians in recent weeks. It's a back and forth with neither party establishing a permanent foothold in the village. But it does look like, if you look at the pins here, and we have both mappers having their pins. The Russians are making gains back where the Ukrainians have pushed them, and so it does look like the Russians have geared up and produced a counter themselves to what the Ukrainians were doing, reversing the momentum there in that sector. And that's a real worry, and probably says that the Ukrainians really don't have all that much in reserve, or are they waiting for the Russians to properly attack on a bigger offensive? There are rumors that the Russians are gearing up for a Zaporizhzhia offensive, and in fact they are attacking in Zaporizhzhia, and there's video footage coming out. I'm not exactly sure where in Zaporizhzhia. I assume it's probably down here where you can see all the pins, but it could be that Ukrainians are keeping people behind rather than attack. They're going to use them defensively, or maybe they just don't have the reserves that sometimes we think they might. And then further, against Surat maps though, further claims of Russian advances all the way down this front. Interesting though that there's some reversal around Andriivka, but it's much further to the west of Andriivka along the road that comes out of it. That's good news because it's a pretty important area, but the Russians, filling in a lot of this is according to Surat maps, although there's quite a big difference between the maps here as well. The orange line here denotes where Surat maps thinks the Russians are holding their defences up to there. They control that robustly. Andrew Perpetua has them right back here. So it's a massive difference between the two. And in they had this outpost in Rosliv there, where you can see, according to Andrew Perpetua, they've advanced down these tree lines, got into there, and are able to supply that. But it's more of a grey zone either side of that. The Surat maps has all of that in control of the Russians, and going further to the south as well. And just, fairly substantial gains. Yes, it's 11 days, but actually it gives you an idea. Sometimes it's quite useful to take these breaks. And then you can see, oh, goodness me, right, the Russians are really, because otherwise these would have been incremental, a day showing a few gains here, a day showing a few gains there, and you put it all together over 11 days and you see that the Russians really are pushing where they had seemingly culminated. It's interesting to know whether they were just waiting for fresh recruits to come through and it's just a short-term culmination. I mean, it definitely was a culmination, as in they stopped, they were having a breather, they'd exhausted themselves, they couldn't move on as quickly as they were. Last month was a very slow month for them because it was all about Kursk. So what you might have seen is them taking back Kursk, and then they had 60 to 70,000 troops up here apparently. You suddenly go, right, okay, we can carry on our momentum into Sumy, but actually 30,000 of those troops, 40,000 of those troops can be repositioned down this front line in different places, and then that's going to make a tangible difference to the outcomes of these front lines, of these battles going on. So we have the kind of Veselivka area being expanded by the Russians. It's all fairly challenging news for the Ukrainians. Really difficult to see all of these pins. And then when we come across to Kamyanka, some gains for the Russians around Malishbaki and around Pyatikhatki and Zherebyanki here, coming up towards Kamyanska. So this is an area where the Ukrainians had a little bit of success, pushed the Russians back, and now the Russians are attacking, and this could be the area of Zaporizhzhia where we might see the offensive that has been discussed. We have seen an uptick in videos coming out of supposedly repelled Russian attacks where they have taken some fairly heavy casualties, but of course, that's fine for the Russians as long as they are taking land. And that's pretty much that. That's the frontline update. Sorry, my intimate knowledge of each of these areas is not what it should be, given my break of a week. So hopefully we'll get back to normal schedules going forward. But that's what's been going on the front lines for the last 11 days. Thanks, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.